right, we are right on time. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from around the world. Welcome to today's session of the Cities on the Frontline Speaker Series. I am Jordana Vasquez, Senior Manager for Climate Resilience and Equity at the Resilient Cities Network, and I'll be your co-host today. I am especially excited about today's Resilience for Communities with Community session, which highlights the essential role of community voices in shaping meaningful, impactful solutions. For those joining us for the first time, Cities on the Frontline is a virtual thought leadership speaker series featuring solutions by cities for cities. The speaker series began in 2020 through a partnership between the Resilient Cities Network and the World Bank's Group City Resilience Program. The series provides city practitioners and the industries and residents that they support with a platform for knowledge exchange. Today's session of the Cities in the Frontline Speakers is hosted with the support of Zurich North America. And before we start, let me remind everyone of the intentions of the speaker series and the ground rules for the conversation today. The purpose of these global series is to have an open and an honest learning conversation. We ask you not to attribute any comments unless you have the person's express permission to do so, and we can help you obtain this permission if needed. Today, we have over 300 registered participants. So to facilitate the discussion, we ask you to write your questions on the Q&A function of Zoom at the bottom of the screen. And please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and share why you're interested in the session. Please know that the recording of the session, as well as the summary and the presentation materials, will be all posted online on the Resilient Cities Network site. And with that said, welcome everyone again. We're so excited for the conversation ahead. Please join me in welcoming our co-host for today's session, Kelly Borden from Zurich North America, who will introduce today's topic and speakers. Kelly, over to you.
Thanks, Georgiana. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I too want to add my welcome to all of you for joining us today. I am excited to introduce this Urban Resilience series, as Jordana mentioned, in partnership between Zurich Insurance Company and the Resilient Cities Network. This is the second of three sessions in our sort of inaugural kickoff. And our session today will explore the crucial role that community-driven resilience plays in addressing the complex climate challenges facing our cities and towns throughout the world. We have three really great speakers with us today. I'm very excited to present to you David Nash, Head of Adapting to Climate Change at the Z Zurich Foundation, Nuha Eltaneh, Senior Expert for Urban Resilience and Climate Adaptation at the International Council for Local Environmental Initiatives, or commonly known as ICLEI, and Dr. Hang Rubin, the principal and founder of Sheet Community Engagement Consulting. You're going to hear from me again shortly in a little bit with some activities we have planned so that we can also learn from you. But for now, I'm going to turn the floor over to David Nash. David, take us away.
Yeah, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here as well. I'll just share my screen with you if you just give me 1 second to call that up. And hopefully everyone can see the screen in front of you. I think one thing that is become abundantly clear over the course of the last decade, certainly, that I've been involved with this climate adaptation space, is that the world climate is changing and changing rapidly. We are definitely, undeniably getting hotter as a planet. Last year, we topped 1.5 degrees on average. It's the first year that that's happened. It is definitely at the top end of where we should be under the Paris Agreement. And it's also clear that the world is not doing enough in order to try and curb that and to reach the Paris targets. But, you know, even if we were doing enough, there is already change that has been baked in that will affect people, and you see it every day. Most recently, the floods in Valencia caused by freak weather that was not expected that overwhelmed that city and that region completely, causing deaths and destruction along the way. 3.3 billion of us across the planet live in such hotspots and are subject to this sudden change and sudden threat. Increasingly, of that 3.3 billion, many live in cities. Currently, the urban population of the world is around 56%. It's scheduled on its current trends to reach 70% by 2050. That's an increasingly urbanized world that we're living in. And it's no surprise, really, that we're becoming increasingly urbanized with the attractions, economic prospects that cities can offer. And it's undeniably true that on average across cities, people are better off in cities than their rural counterparts. What that statistic doesn't show, though, is the masked contrast between the haves and the have-nots. Up to a quarter of all population farm dwellers living in precarious situations, not only with no access to wealth, but no access to power, to fuel, to the basics of life like water and sanitation. So increasingly, people are coming to cities and increasingly living in rural. Again, increasingly people are coming to cities and living in precarious situations. That vulnerability is only exacerbated when climate change hits. So the hazards that come along affect those that are vulnerable more than anything else. It is clear, certainly to me anyway, that urban resilience is a key topic we need to focus on. So what do we mean by urban resilience? Well, let's take a quick look at what we mean by resilience. Over the course of the last decade, the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance and now the Zurich Climate Resilience Alliance have been working on this idea of trying to understand what resilience is and where it comes from, trying to build up a picture of how communities actually experience climate hazard and what helps them to survive. And one of the things that we've discovered in that kind of journey is that just about every organization you talk to has a definition of resilience. That definition of resilience varies across different organizations. Some focus on one thing rather than another. But when you actually boil it down to it, when you kind of drill down into the things that we all hold in common, we think that this definition of resilience is probably something close to something we can all sign up to. The ability of a system, community, or society. In other words, how does the community, what's the community got that allows it to pursue its social, ecological, economic development and growth objectives? So how does it thrive while managing its disaster risk over time in a mutually reinforcing way? And looking at that definition and trying to unpin that in layman's terms, what we've really discovered is that good resilience is built through good community development. Looking at how communities develop, how you overcome this systemic challenge of vulnerability at a community level is part and parcel of how you provide resilience in the face of shock. The way in which you can build development is the way in which you can create that resilience for communities. Many things, it turns out, can add to resilience. It doesn't have to be big infrastructure projects that we're looking at in order for people to feel more resilient. And a lot of the work that we've been doing is trying to unpack and understand what it is that can add to that resilience. We all know that there's a need. Where we have a barrier to that need is how do we understand what to do to try and face it. All of the cities, I'm sure, that we work with, all the cities, the city network partners that we work with, all have resilience strategies, resilience plans, desires to improve resilience. But how do you find out what to do? This is where our urban climate resilience program comes into its own. Built upon 10 years experience with the Zurich Flood Resilience Alliance, we have developed a process of understanding how communities actually function and what happens to them when they get hit by disaster. We're currently operating in 9 different countries across 15 different cities with a number of different partners, which you'll see on the screen, including resilient cities and including ICLE, who are also on this call. The whole process that we use starts with the use of what we call our Climate Resilience Measurement for Communities approach, or CRMC. The CRMC is a tool which is basically an analysis tool. It works directly with communities, understanding what their lived experience is really like, and how it is that they use the things that they have within their communities. That's the physical infrastructure, the financial backing, the natural environment, and indeed their own skills, knowledge, and organizational abilities. And all of those factors all play together in an interconnected way. What the tool allows us to do is allows us to understand the quality and the strength of what people have and how they use it, understand where those strengths overlap with things that are perhaps weaker, and enable us to come up with and design interventions that enable us to get over that resilience and to build resilience out properly. In other words, it enables us to identify what it is we need to do for each community to build resilience. Now, that's all very well looking at how we build resilience in individual spaces, but what it also does, by working with different communities in similar environments, it enables us to look at how we can scale that. And scale is the name of the game, really, in the resilience world. So many people are affected by the climate change situation that we really do need to think about how we can reach many more. And one organisation like Zurich, with its funding, can't solve the problem on its own. Indeed, we can't even solve the problem in one single place on our own. It's a very multi-part kind of environment. So how do we work to try and move that together? This is where we come to our thinking around scale, because one of the things that needs to emerge from the work we do on the ground is not just leaving it as one or two communities that benefit from what we do, but rather thinking about how those communities can act as exemplars, act as ways, pathfinders, if you like, to how to get to many more. And we scale in a number of different ways. We can scale deeper within those communities by looking at bringing in additional funding from other places. Part of the reason we work directly with our Zurich business unit colleagues is because of their relationship with a wider private sector stakeholder group, who we can try and understand and infuse to come and support us on this journey and to add value to what we're doing on the ground. We can also scale wider into the city, and so taking the work of one or two communities across the whole of the city. And that's again why we choose to work in cities with city partners who are connected directly to city authorities. By working and understanding how City Hall works, by working with City Hall, you can try to understand how their priorities and their resources and their strategies can be brought to bear around the resilience agenda as well, because cities also want their communities to develop. But it's also wider than that too. The city networks that we work with ICLEI, with C40, for example, and with the Resilient Cities Network, have connections to many more cities than we can possibly work in on our own. And by looking at good practice and looking at ways of developing it, we can take that learning out to wider cities and help to move that dial further. It is really clear to me that climate adaptation is the name of the game at the moment. People are suffering from the effects of the already changed climate, and helping them to understand how to deal with that, how to enable themselves to improve their lives and thrive even in the face of climate shock, is what we need to try and do. But it's equally clear that we cannot do that alone, and we need to find ways in which we can bring many more people into the agenda. Thanks very much. Back to you, Jordana, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you, David, for your presentation and the overview you provided. I'm going to hand it over to Nuha now for her presentation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Jordana. And maybe I will start with a quick overview. I'm Nuha Elkaneh. I'm presenting ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability. And I will start maybe by highlighting 3 key areas that I will focus on my presentation today. So if you go into the next slide, you can see that I'll be speaking first with a quick intro about who we are and an overview of the implementation of the UCRP program that David just took us through, in particular in Izmir. That's the city that we're working with at the moment. And then what do we do for that? So how do we actually engage with the key stakeholders, and what do we mean by urban resilience governance? And then we go into the last point, which is how do we do that? The CRMC tool that is being implemented, but also our knowledge and expertise from different urban resilience assessments and indicators. In the next slide, that's where I will start by introducing eClay. So in the next slide, you get to see our wide range of network. We have a network of over 2,500 local and regional governments with 22 offices around the world. We're active in more than 100 countries, and we try to support these countries in different ways across what we call the interconnected development pathways. In the next slide, more focus on our office where I'm coming from, which we are based in Freiburg in Germany, the European Secretariat, where we have over 170 members across Europe, and we provide a wide range of the services that you see at the bottom of the slide. Now, maybe moving more into focus about why Izmir and the city that we are working with at the moment. And here you can see that we have been focusing in Izmir in particular on two different neighborhoods. In the upcoming slides as well, I will highlight more on why Izmir, the different socioeconomic and physical vulnerabilities. But the reason why I'm bringing this slide here in particular is linkages into what David have been presented in his intervention, speaking about the meanings of resilience, the different principles. But what I wanted to emphasize more here, and in particular in that project, is the selection of the communities and what does that mean actually for community resilience, and understanding that the community is a multi-layered notion. So it's being acknowledged that it's not a static entity and it has this dynamic interactions that exist across different scales and levels. So keeping that in mind and moving into the next slide where I will deep dive into why Izmir and the different hazards and vulnerabilities, I would love that you carry along that notion of communities and what do we mean by that, because that will reflect more on the stakeholders' engagement processes. So here in this slide, you come to see that we have been looking into different hazards that Izmir have been exposed to in the past few years, and in particular focusing on flooding, droughts and wildfires, because what we are trying to map through the CRMC tool and the UCRP program is actually the community's vulnerabilities into floods and heat waves. But what we also try to do here is actually starting by knowing how the city thinks. And at the bottom of this slide, you come to see one of the results of our previous engagement before the UCRP program, and mentioning also that Izmir is one of our city members, is actually the development of the Green City Action Plan of Izmir, where we managed to define what we call the key environmental investments and policy actions that the city is actually prioritizing as environmental challenges, and try from there to link that into the UCRP program. What does that mean for the communities? And not only having what we call the horizontal level of community engagement, but also the vertical level at the different governance levels. In the next slide, also what we have done, I will also just give a very quick overview on that, which is the understanding of the Izmir as a peninsula, its landscape, a spatial landscape, the human environmental interaction of the different challenges, and also being a metropolitan city. But also what does that mean in comes when understanding the different urbanization processes and how that has affected Izmir in different ways with the transformation of agricultural land and moving into what we call the semi-urban or urban uses. In the next slide, also, what we've tried to do is mapping the socioeconomic vulnerabilities of the city, not forgetting that it's one of the mostly densely populated cities in Turkey, and having being ranked actually as also have a high level of socioeconomic development and competitive index. So we're not only looking into, let's say, the challenges, but also the opportunities that could be created for the communities there, and keeping in mind as well the contextual element of Izmir and being a point where of attraction when it comes into, or maybe a migration corridor from the MENA region and across into Europe, and this very high level of socioeconomic vulnerabilities that is associated with the changes in the job and the housing markets, and what does that mean actually when it comes into tackling climate change vulnerabilities. And in the next slide, we're showing here just the progress of the project. So now we are coming into the end of the second year of the project, completing the data collection process and moving into interventions. Now, maybe going to the next slide, you can see that I will start shifting more after giving you this quick overview and context of what the project is about, where are we implementing it, in which phase are we now, into what do we do actually in order to hopefully achieve a successful implementation of that project, and the key engagement of the stakeholders when it comes into urban resilience governance. So in the next slide, we are showing here maybe 3 key questions that I would try to address very briefly. What urban resilience governance is all about, who are the key stakeholders we are engaged with in that context of the city, but how do we engage with them and when, which are very critical moments. In the next slide, a quick overview of what urban resilience governance, so a bit of theory here, but trying to highlight on 3 key elements. The organizing and delivering of resilience, which are 2 different components and very important that we highlight on each and every one and give the space to consider that. Understanding the ecosystem of the city, and then how do we co-design solutions for inclusive and sustainable resilience. In the next slide, we also, in that project, tried to look into 3 key areas: the resilience of what, resilience to what, and resilience for whom. And why is that important? It's important that we address these 3 components because when we speak about urban resilience efforts that the city can implement together with that project, we're considering the potential of social equity impacts and the prioritization of needs for the most vulnerable. And what we are also aware of, that we do not want to come up with solutions that could reproduce unjust outcomes and within and between the communities, because we have, as I mentioned, the diverse element of the host communities and the refugee communities. So the resilience of what is more on the urban context, diversity of the structure of the cities, its form, governance, function, and different experiences. The resilience of to what, which we are looking into the diverse challenges of heat waves and flooding, but for whom is more important part, which is what we call the consideration of the intergenerational justice, is how resilience building can actually present solutions that might impact future generations, and always remembering that disasters and its inequalities are sometimes framed, it's inevitable. So how do we actually come up with the most suitable solutions at all levels of governance? In the next slide, these are some of the questions that we're trying to also understand and explore. How do we include the communities? How to utilize the knowledge that we have within our networks and their geographic context to create the balance between municipal budgeting and the solutions that are being proposed, but also the resilience efforts at all levels of governance. Now, I'm moving to the next question about who are the key stakeholders. And if you see in the next slide, we have that wide spectrum of key stakeholders that we always know and consider when it comes into key stakeholders engagement in such projects. But also what I wanted to indicate here is not only the mapping exercise of the key stakeholders, but understanding the relationships and dynamics between them. Because urban governance processes, it's about understanding how power and politics shapes the planning processes and the social learning that we can take away from that project. In the upcoming slides, you can just see some few examples of the different engagements processes. So this one was, I would say, an early stage of understanding who's there and have this gradual engagement with the key stakeholders and have that testing of their sense of what do we mean by urban resilience and how can we move on from there. And then in the next slide, we started questioning how to engage them. So after understanding who is in the room, we come into using the model that you see in the next slide, which is informing, consulting, involving, collaborating, and empowerment. And what we needed to do here actually is understanding who do we engage. So we know who's in the room, but how are we going to engage them and when are we going to engage them? Because again, we're trying to acknowledge here that there is a knowledge production process that is taking place across the implementation of the UCRP program. So how can we actually make sure that the resilience building at the community level is not misunderstood as an external process, but actually a collaborative decision-making process? And then that power and knowledge are mutually constitutive and conferring one another when it comes into authority, legitimacy, and credibility of the different solutions that are going to be developed with the community. Another also few examples in the next slide about also understanding that it's a process, it's not a once-off approach, and some of the few upcoming images that also show some of the key engagement of the recent processes on the data collection and observations of human behavior on the ground with the household surveys and the focus group discussions. Last but not least, maybe I will close my presentation here just by giving an overview of how that applies when it comes into eClay, because again, we have this principles of the multi-level action and multi-level governance. So you can see here vertically the different levels of the multi-level governance and how actually we try to do that in the next slide, where we have the integration and the impact happening on the ground from the local business unit in Turkey, and how also that have been embedded actually into the socioeconomic and cultural context, engaging the children and the youth in the process of neighborhood cleaning and raising awareness of climate change in order to set the scene of the upcoming initiatives. So I will close here and maybe leave the upcoming slides for the follow-up discussions about the CRMC tool and the different urban resilience assessments and indicators, and how can we really learn lessons from the actual activities that we are conducting at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Nuha. Before we hear from our last speaker, we want to take a moment to hear from you, our audience. We have a couple of activities that will allow us to learn from you about what's top of mind when it comes to what's needed to drive community resilience and what the long-term impacts of community resilience can be. So we're going to start with a polling question. Nicole, if I can ask you to pull up the poll. We have a question for you. What action is most needed to drive community resilience in your community? Is it resident education and awareness, top-down government prioritization, external partnerships and financial support, and grassroots advocacy and action? So if you can just give us your thought there, either the city that you live in, the city that you work in, the city that you're here representing. Give us your thoughts on what you feel is most needed in order to drive successful community resilience in your community. And we'll just give that a minute. Okay. Nicole, do you want to pull up the poll response? Interesting, a very good sort of distribution across all the questions. Education and awareness with a slight lead, top-down government prioritization, certainly shortly there behind. But really, I think there's opportunities across the board. Thank you for that. I think that will help all of us kind of inform where we need to put forth our efforts to try to help build that community resilience. Next, I'm going to ask Michelle to take over control of the screen. We have a word cloud for you. So for those of you that are on your desktops or on your computers, if you don't mind taking out your phone and scanning that QR code, it's going to take you to a program called Slido. If you're on your phone and you want to go over to your browser, you can also go to www.slido.com. And then for those of you going to the website, you'll need to put in that code. You shouldn't need to do that if you're using the QR code. But the question that we'd like you to consider, and thank you for those of you who have already are familiar with the word cloud idea, but yeah, what we'd like you to do in, one word or phrase, what would lasting community resilience mean in your community? So this is great. Thank you for jumping right in. We'll give another couple of minutes. Again, if this is, the community that you live in, the community you work in, the community you represent, but please tell us what long-lasting or lasting community resilience would mean for your community. Safety, and for those of you who are not familiar with the word cloud concept, the larger the word appears in the word cloud, the more frequent the answer is being given. So clearly safety and security is coming across as a very common theme in terms of what lasting community resilience would mean. Sustainability, well-being, connection, capacity, trust, solidarity, equity, all of those things are emerging as themes. So we thank you for that. We'll just give it another minute. It looks like there's still several of you that are typing. If you want to enter more, you can certainly enter more responses, but we thank you all for participating in this word cloud. This is really great feedback for us. Okay, looks like we still have a couple more people. We'll just give you another couple of minutes. We want to make sure we get enough time to complete the presentations, but this is excellent. Thank you so very much for this. All right. Okay, I think the themes are emerging. Michelle can keep the poll going. But I think we can go back to the presentation. All right, so I'm going to turn it back over to Hung.
Great, thank you, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen, so please just give me one quick second. Sorry. Great. Okay, so hello, everyone. Again, I'm Dr. Hangleng Rubin, and I'm really delighted to be here with everyone today. I really want to thank the Zurich Foundation and the Resilient Cities Network for offering me and, really Boston Chinatown this opportunity to talk about the work that we do. My great-grandfather was here in the 1800s, and he helped to settle San Francisco Chinatown. So Chinatowns really across the globe have a lot of meaning for me. And I'm also really excited after hearing the first two presenters, because I think that what I'm going to share today will resonate with some of the earlier presentations. And I also just wanted to say, so I'm here to talk about community resilience in Chinatown. And when I think about resilience, when I think about Chinatown, I've started to use an ecological metaphor for thinking about how do we grow this neighborhood, right? How do we create a resilient neighborhood, even using some metaphors from the natural world? So I wanted to actually so I'm a community engagement specialist, and I wanted to start by actually just having us think about, what do we think we know about Chinatowns? We see a lot about Chinatowns in the news. And, one thing that I always want to tell people is that Chinatown, because I often think that outsiders, and particularly government, we get labeled as vulnerable and marginalized community. And I want people to know that we are so much more than that. I always start by telling people that Chinatown is and always has been a resilient community. Now, at the same time, David was talking about the shock that occurs to different communities. And so some of Chinatown's systemic wounds were urban renewal and highway construction in the 1950s and 1960s, which took away housing, which changed the landscape of Chinatown, which destroyed social networks. And then there was also Tufts institutional expansion in the 1970s and the 1980s, which did similar things in terms of taking away land from Chinatown. And Tufts actually, between Tufts University and Tufts Medical Center, it occupies about a third of the land in Chinatown. And we are still grappling with the long-term effects of urban renewal, with institutional expansion, and then most recently, displacement and gentrification. Now, as I was saying earlier, I believe that community resilience has always been woven throughout the fabric of our neighborhood. So even in the early days, before urban renewal, before institutional expansion, building community institutions such as restaurants and family associations, that was really important to us. And even in the urban renewal process in the 1950s and 60s, Chinatown negotiated 3,000 units of affordable housing for the neighborhood. And then what you see in the 1970s, the 1980s, the 1990s is really a lot of community organizing and advocacy to bring different kinds of institutions that a neighborhood needs. So you see, the South Cove Community Health Center. You see the Josiah Quincy Elementary School. The Metropolitan was a piece of land that was contested. Tufts wanted to use it as a parking lot, and the community fought to reclaim that land, and they built affordable housing on that unit, as well as permanent space for some of our key nonprofits in the neighborhood. In the 2000s, you also see the continuing of affordable housing, both rentals and apartments. And then we started to see, other features for a neighborhood, such as an outdoor playground. We didn't have an outdoor playground in Chinatown. Chinatown is a neighborhood with families that we have no park. We saw the opening of the Powell Art Center. We recently celebrated the Josiah Quincy Upper School building in Chinatown. And something that I was also a part of is that Chinatown is going to see the return of its branch library after that was also taken down urban renewal. And all of these things that I was just I mentioned, all of this has come through organizing and advocacy and relationship building and people really laboring to maintain and sustain Chinatown. Now, one thing that many of us in Chinatown talk about is that Chinatown has moved from a period of just focus on, we're just trying to survive, we're trying to overcome the shock of urban renewal and institutional expansion, and now we are a thriving community. And, under that lens, we have been able to think more about, okay, what is about open space? What is arts and culture? And how does that contribute to a healthy, thriving community and a community that focuses health and well-being? Now, this is something that I just came up with as I was thinking about the work that I've done in Boston Chinatown. And really, what are the elements of community leadership? And I thought it was interesting, the poll that was created and how, there was a very similar, what people would prioritize. And from my perspective, in having been involved in different community efforts, I think all these elements are really important. So we need community leadership. Of course, we need resident engagement. We need partnership with the city. We need people, who are insiders in the city, helping us move the dial on these issues. We need funders. We need organizations to come together and do collaborative and collective work. We need partnerships with neighborhood institutions. So we've been building partnerships with Tufts to think about how we can repair some of the wounds of the past. And we do need external funders who want to listen to the community and help us achieve our priorities and our dreams and our vision for the neighborhood. I wanted to also just give two examples of some of the work that I believe really demonstrates the community resilience of the neighborhood. And one of them is a collective that I facilitated called Chinatown Hope. And 8 different community-based organizations came together. And I really appreciate this kind of funding model that I have seen some funders like Resilient Cities do, where instead of a funder just coming in and saying, okay, you need to focus on housing, they actually give communities time to do engagement, to find out from residents and locals, what is it that you prioritize? And that is what Chinatown Hope started with. We started with the planning process to find out what communities cared about. And we found out that it was around open space. Chinatown has one of the lowest percentages of open space and green space in the city of Boston. And they see it, and they cared about open space because of its focus on its need for wellness and emotional wellness as well. And so Chinatown Hope brought together 8 of our really key community-based organizations spanning social service, housing, residents, businesses, organizing, arts and culture, and really wove together this collective to help move the needle on open space in Chinatown. And I can also say that, we do need other tools and we need other resources. And, our ability to move the dial on open space in Boston Chinatown also built upon, data and reports that communities have done. And it also relied on, reports that academics had done, as well as things from the city. And communities both know what is important, and having having research and data and, allies also affirm that, such as the heat challenge, the low tree canopy, the fact that Chinatown has the highest percentage of air pollution, across Massachusetts because of its proximity to the highway. We also need these data points to help us make the case for, government funding and priorities to come into the city. And one thing that I'm really proud about is that, Chinatown Hope, we had we decided to focus our efforts on an area in Boston called Phillips Square. This is where we launched our initiative 2 years ago to really bring attention to this aspect of the neighborhood, and how could we build, how could we design and reimagine Phillips Square so that it was a place that addressed some of these climate resilient challenges that the neighborhood faced. And I'm actually really proud to say that, a community organization had done a lot of work in amplifying the need for Phillips Square. And when our 8 group collective came together and gave more, gave more attention and shed light on that now we've actually seen an RFP come out from the city that we are going to do the design of Phillips Square and try to turn that into a more permanent tactical plaza that can address issues around green infrastructure, heat resilience, climate resilience, arts and culture. And then I just want to close by saying that, Chinatown Hope has actually pollinated another resilient strategy here in Chinatown that we're calling Cool Down Chinatown. And, actually with the support of the Zurich Foundation, the Resilient City Networks, we are now tackling other challenges that have come up. And some of this came to our attention in some of our meetings in Chinatown Hope. And Chinatown, Cool Down Chinatown really takes a public health socio-ecological perspective on thinking about, how we can address climate resilience in the neighborhood. That will focus on heat education workshops, building institutional partnerships, having a micro grant for businesses, and developing or pulling together a working group of city stakeholders, communities, businesses, and residents to develop a heat action plan for Boston Chinatown. So I just, again, wanted to thank, the Resilient City Networks and Zurich Foundation for, offering Boston Chinatown this opportunity to, talk about and amplify our work. And, again, I think just the last thing I always want to say, in these is that, it is really important to, really talk to people on the ground, to really talk to residents and find out, what their needs are. And that, again, I just want to say again that, communities like Chinatown, we are more than a vulnerable and a marginalized community. And I can tell the story that I actually brought those words to a resident group once in Boston Chinatown, and they were actually really offended. They were actually really offended that this is how outsiders, perceive residents in the neighborhood. So thank you again, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much, Hong. For those that do not know, we were working together on this project in Boston, so I am so excited to see it on the screen and really looking forward to the implementation of this work. For everyone, all of our speakers, thank you so much for your presentations. I always feel extremely inspired about all of your work and experience and outlook. And because we are short in time, which sometimes does happen when you're having such rich discussion, in the interest of time, we'll be able to do a quick round of Q&A. So if you haven't had the chance, please add your question to the chat, the lower right. But I do see a couple of questions coming, and we're going to be starting with you, David. You started the conversation framing the current climate crisis, and we definitely have no shortage of hazards affecting our communities, affecting our cities. Therefore, the question is, how does Zurich envision their role evolving to adapt to new hazards, new demands in this new climate?
That's a really excellent question, Jordana. We started off our work looking at floods, simply because floods was by far the biggest impact on communities worldwide. When you take a look at all the losses that occurred from natural hazards over the previous decades from when we started, it all boiled down basically to floods. It was floods plus a combination of everything else. And floods was at least half of everything at that point. It's still pretty well the biggest thing, so you'll see a lot of discussion around floods, and we still focus on that. But increasingly in cities, heat is becoming a significant problem, and heat is been built into our work on tools to enable us to look at heat. We've also built into the tools questions around wildfire and understanding how communities can understand how they can be resilient towards wildfire threats, and recently we've added into the tools a component on storms, which is predominantly the wind factor of storms. So flooding follows on from a storm. It brings a lot of rainfall usually, and the flooding we already understand how to deal with. The wind factor was a slightly different question, and so that kind of has been built into the tools as well. The one big missing piece, I think, and that's not necessarily directly affecting resilience of cities, but resilience of the ecosystem around cities, which is a big question about drought. Drought is a particularly challenging topic because it doesn't behave in the same way that the hazards I've just described are. So the hazards we're talking about previously are all fairly rapid onset. They last a few days, they move on, they leave behind them an aftermath. Drought is potentially a long-term problem. It's a result of cascading failures and understanding about why things are happening and how you build resilience to drought is not a case of understanding a drought appearing and disappearing. So I think we're going to need to do a lot more thinking about how droughts can be brought into that equation, but it's definitely something that we're on thinking around. In terms of where Zurich fits into that, a lot of the work we've done on the CRMC and understanding how to consider this multi-dimensional data set that communities represent is to try to adopt some of the practices that our colleagues in our Zurich Resilience Services teams do when they assess risk. So when they assess risk for customers, they look at a very wide variety of different factors and assess those in the round. And we've taken a lot of that thinking to help us understand that in the resilience terms. They therefore have a lot of expertise in and around this whole risk space, which keeps giving us the questions to ask around how we tackle some of these challenges in the future. And I can see that Zurich as a organisation bringing those skills into the mix are part of what we add to the equation. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you, David. And that's a great segue to the next question that we have. And the next question would be for Nuha. Talking about risk under the umbrella of heat and flood. Nuha, this also connects to one of the questions that came in on the chat, and I think you didn't have enough time to talk on the slide about the CRMC. So this might be a great opportunity to dive a little deeper into that. The question is, what are the main indicators for measuring whether a city is more resilient than another? Is there an index? And is there an index? So I saw that David added a bit of an answer here in the chat, but if we could maybe talking to the context of Izmir and your communities that you're working on. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Jordana. And as you mentioned, David have already provided an excellent overview of that. But also what I may just add into it here is that it looks into different components. So we're looking into the social elements, the economic elements, the environmental elements. But what is also very interesting about the CRMC tool, that the element that it's not a once-off process. So it's taking into consideration the element of time and how resilience changes across the different, I would say, periods of time, pre-disaster and post-disaster. And this is actually a very important element because as I mentioned also earlier, in the definition of the community, that we've learned a common lesson from the use of the different resilience assessment tools and indicators. It is not only about what you are measuring, but when are you measuring it, and understanding also that the needs of the further improvements and the dynamics over time and space. So the more of the employing of what we call the iterative process, involving scenario-based planning in those different indicators in order to address the challenges that are not only associated with current events, but also uncertainties. Because as we all know, with climate change, stresses, we've seen what happened in Valencia recently. There is always these uncertainties, no matter what we predict and no matter what we measure with those indicators. Without considering time and change across space, we will not be able to come into at least the more realistic results that we can build our solutions accordingly.
Thank you. And a follow-up question about, in one of the slides you mentioned about the community engagement piece and how this is going to eventually lead into the implementation of solutions. How do you foresee the work on the ground influencing local policy and advocacy for your community?
Yes. So in terms of influencing local policy, I think it starts from the very early stage of understanding the city thinking and what is actually a priority for the city. Having said that, that does not mean that we are ignoring what the community's needs and priorities are, because this is what the UCRP program is all about. But understanding the element of the multi-level governance, which I have shown also in one of the slides earlier, because you are moving from the level of governance into communication, into understanding frameworks of organizational resilience, and then the multi-level, what we call the systems approach, and the multi-level partnership approach. So at each and every level of those multi-level actions, the city has a role to play, the communities has a role to play, and the different key stakeholders, the local NGOs also have a very significant role to play with all other actors, research, the academia, health, education, etc. So in order to influence policy, we can't really, I would say, skip one of these layers. It has to go as a multi-layer process to move from one level to the other in order to achieve the impact that we are aiming to achieve. And what is also very interestingly important about this project is the evidence-based approach. So we are carrying along our cities, we are carrying along the Turkish business unit together with that knowledge production, because the more they know, the more they can actually advocate for changes when it comes into policy and decision-making processes.
Thank you, Nuha. And we have time for one more question. I'll say I really love the way that we started from like the global perspective and then focusing into the city and then grounding it into the communities. So we have time for, as I said, for one more question. This would be for Hong. Hong, how can communities shift from being reactive to climate hazards and be more proactive, forward-looking instead? What do you think it's missing, and what is the biggest challenges faced?
That's a great question, Jordania. I think that I think what can I actually think a lot of communities are very forward looking. I think what happens is that people I think getting the ear of external stakeholders, getting the ear of funders, getting the ear of the city. I think we need to have more conversation. I think people on the outside need to be more in tune with what communities care about and what's going on with communities. I mean, what I've seen in Boston Chinatown is that a lot of efforts like Phillips Square, the library, I mean, they've taken decades. And I think that with the climate crisis that we have today, we can't wait 20 years to see action happen. And I think, really just bringing communities and, city and other external stakeholders to the table is really important. I mean, even in the process of putting together our working group for Cool Down Chinatown, I hear that, the city is working on different initiatives, and what we need to do is align what communities care about and what their needs are with what cities, believe that they're doing. And I think, people in the city realize they also need to be spending more time, in communities and really hearing. And I think communities can be that, focal point of bringing these different stakeholders, with city, with technical knowledge, bringing them together to support the efforts that we have on the ground level. So I think part of it is, some of it is actually really simple. It's just people coming together to the same table and really working on these issues together.
I have to agree with that. The close partnership with the city and also the community-based organizations on the ground that are doing the work, the boots on the ground. Great. So we have a couple of more minutes, and I did want to have our speakers give final reflections. So quick 30 seconds, and then we'll do closing remarks. So we'll start with you, David. Just quick last reflections.
Thanks, Jordana. Quickly, from a reflection point of view, I think resilience building is hyper-local. Resilience affects people at a very hyper-local kind of level. But we can't just focus just on the hyper-local, doing one community at a time. We have to find ways in which we can scale, and that means multi-sector, multi-dimensional partnerships over long periods of time. This isn't a one-off fix-it kind of problem. This is a building thing. I think somebody said that there is multi-annual, multi-decadal even opportunities to have to work on with this. So it's all about working together and trying to find ways in which we can collaborate more effectively. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Nuha?
I think learning from the communities is the key word, maybe the key point that I would like to bring in, and how do we actually capture that knowledge is the key question mark that we are trying to figure out, and hopefully learning from each other through that global partnership and the different partners as part of the Zurich Foundation, we will come to this approach and improve on our learnings as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuha. And last, Han?
So I think I've amplified the importance of working with communities and community-based organizations. And one of the challenges they always face is, how limited and time-bound funding is. I think if we could create, again, containers and ecosystems so that when different projects are over, or different initiatives are over, that they've been able to pollinate, that next initiative. So again, that communities can, like if you think about communities as gardens, so that communities can grow and be healthy and thrive. Thank you.
Thank you. I do love the thought of communities as gardens. Wonderful, everyone. So we are almost at time. And I just want to give a big thank you to our speakers and audience for joining us today. It was my absolute pleasure to have this conversation. I really enjoy learning from you, your perspectives and your insights. Everyone, please watch our website for the session's recording and summary. And stay tuned for our next session on Wednesday, November, bridging sectors, using corporate and philanthropic funding for community resilience. So hope to see you all then. And thank you, whatever you're connecting from, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you, everyone.